Witchwater by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 3. Lynn did not have long to wonder whether she should tell Mouse about either the crows or the spider medallion, because the phone rang just then, and a terrified voice pleaded, "Lynn, come over quick!" "What's wrong, Mouse? What's happened?" "Oh, hurry, I'll tell you later." Lynn dropped the receiver back on the phone and bounded out the front door. Rushing down the porch steps, she crossed the lawn, jumped off the rock wall to the brick sidewalk below, and ran down the hill 2 blocks to the Beasley house. She could see Marjorie waiting for her behind the screen. As soon as Lynn came up the porch, Mouse stepped out. Her eyes were huge behind the heavy lenses of her round glasses, but the rest of her small face looked pinched and drained of color. "Look up there," she said, pointing to a large walnut tree. Lynn looked up, already knowing. There were the 9 black crows, silent, watching. "I think they've been following me," Mouse whispered in a tense, dry voice. "I noticed them on my way to school this morning, but I didn't think much about it. Then after I left you at your house coming home, I noticed them following me along from tree to tree. When I went to the drugstore just now, I watched to see what they would do. They followed me all the way down there and were waiting for me when I came out. Oh, Lynn!" She threw her arms around her friend. "I'm so scared. What are they going to do to me?" Lynn could feel her shaking. "Mouse, I don't know. I didn't want to scare you, but I noticed the crows following you a week ago when we saw Mrs. Tuggle that day by the creek. After I got up the hill, I looked back and saw them. I didn't know what to do. I knew you'd be scared silly if I told you." They clung to each other for another moment, and suddenly Lynn pushed away, grabbing Mouse by the shoulders. "It's even worse than that, though. I've got to tell you something else." "Oh, Lordy, Lynn. I don't think I want to know." "Okay, I guess I'd better not." No, I've got to find out. Oh, Lynn, I think I'm going to die. I'm so frightened. Tell me quick and get it over with." "Well, this afternoon, I was standing out on the back porch, and suddenly Mrs. Tuggle's cat ran up the steps and leaped up on the table where we keep the geraniums. I saw something gleaming around the cat's neck, so I looked and—" "You touched it!" Mouse shrieked. "You touched the cat?" "Yes." "Oh, Lynn, you shouldn't have done that. I read about that in the book. It gives the animal power over you." Lynn sat down on the steps so her knees wouldn't buckle underneath her. Marjorie crouched beside her. "Did you pet it? Stroke it?" "No, but my fingers touched the fur when I reached for the chain." "What chain?" "It had a silver chain around its neck, and Mouse, there's a medallion on the end with a spider mark on it. It's the same one I saw in the photograph of Mrs. Tuggle's brother. He was wearing it around his neck." Mouse sat with one hand over her mouth, eyes huge. "Is it possible, Lynn?" she breathed at last. "Do you think it could really happen that her brother has come back in the form of a cat?" "I don't know what to think, Mouse. Can you imagine anyone believing that? No one would listen in a million years." "No, but the crows." "They'll believe that?" Lynn said suddenly, jumping up. "They'll have to. They can see it with their own eyes. Come on, Mouse. We're going down to your father's store to show him." They started down the street to the business district with their eyes on the trees overhead. With a shrill cry to the others, the lead crow, the largest of the 9, flapped his wings and rose in the air, moving on to the next tree, and the others followed. Down to Linden's Corner, then 3 blocks on Main, past the shoe repair shop, the beauty parlor, the delicatessen, and finally Mr. Beasley's bookstore. The crows lit on the roof of the library across the street. The girls, unsmiling and frightened, went inside. Mr. Beasley was ringing up a sale and chatting with a man by the cash register. "Hello, girls," he said, and went on talking. But something about Marjorie's face made him turn and look at her again, and soon he cut his conversation short and opened the door for the customer. With the store empty again, he turned to his daughter. "You sick, Marjorie? Stomach upset or something?" Mouse shook her head, but her lips trembled, and the glasses bobbed off her nose at an angle as she wiped her eyes. "Daddy, there are birds following me," she stammered, and somehow Lynn wished she'd put it differently. "There are what?" "Crows," Lynn said quickly. "I've known it for a week, Mr. Beasley, but I didn't want to upset her. But today I noticed them following me to school, and when I went to the drugstore, they followed me there and back, and now they follow me all the way down here," Mouse added breathlessly. "Since when are you afraid of crows?" Her father smiled. This is crow country, girl. The great Midwest. There are always flocks around in the fall. But this is different, Daddy. They've been following me and nobody else. Everywhere I go, they fly in the treetops." "And there are always 9, Lynn said. "I've been counting them, the same 9 crows, and they have a leader. Mr. Beasley frowned and looked rather severely at Lynn. How do you know they're the same 9? Can you honestly tell one crow from another? You can see them, Mr. Beasley. You can watch them yourself. No matter where Marjorie goes, they go along and wait for her. Mr. Beasley turned back to the door, opened it, and stepped outside looking at the sky. Okay, he said. Where are they? Right over there, Mouse said, pointing to the library, but her voice trailed off. Because the roof was bare, there were no crows in sight. Lynn and Mouse turned around and around on the sidewalk, looking up at the rooftops and window ledges, but there wasn't a bird anywhere. Marjorie, I haven't got time for this kind of game, Mr. Beasley grumbled, opening the door again. But they were there, Daddy. They were just a moment ago. Marjorie's father turned to Lynn. And you, young lady, have got an imagination that's going to get you in trouble someday. You're a great girl, Lynn, but sometimes you really get Marjorie hooked on something, witches and sorcerers, and I don't know what all. And I think we ought to call a halt to it right now. You're both creative kids, and you can think of something better to do with your time than scare each other to death. He stepped inside the door, then put his head back out, looking grumpy. Marjorie, there's meatloaf in the refrigerator. Stick it in the oven with a couple of potatoes around 5:30, and I'll try to be home by dinner time. Silently, Lynn and Mouse walked across the street and sat down on a bench, embarrassed at the scene on the sidewalk. There seemed to be nothing to say. How could they possibly fight Mrs. Tuggle and all her tricks? At that moment, they noticed the cat sitting on the steps of the library, a strange animal smile on its face. And then, from the direction of Cowden's Creek, came the 9 crows, one by one alighting there on the roof. Lynn looked across the street at the bookshop to see if, by some miracle, Mr. Beasley might look out and see them, but he was working on the shelves along the far wall and had his back to the door. There was no point in talking to her father about it, Lynn knew. He was having his own problems. The town was divided between people who wanted the community to stay just as it had always been, and people who wanted to replace old things with new. The answer lied somewhere in between, Mr. Morley said one Saturday after he had still another call from citizens worried about what was going to happen. Some people only want what's good for business and never think about all the beauty or the character and personality of a town. And some people are so hung up on keeping things the way they are, they can't understand that some changes might really be for the best. Have they made a decision about the cemetery? Mother asked them from the easy chair where she sat with her manuscript in her lap. No, we're still trying to locate all the relatives of people buried there to see if they would give permission to move the graves to the new cemetery on the east side. A lot of people have grumbled that no one keeps up the old cemetery anyway because it's never been clear who is legally responsible. Frankly, it's a mess. I don't think we're going to reach a decision anytime soon. Has anyone called on Mrs. Tuggle yet about moving her brother's grave? Lynn, who was working on a history paper, stopped writing and listened. No, and it gets stranger every day. I sent one of the clerks over to the library to look up microfilms of 40-year-old newspapers. He can't find a single mention of a boy named Pritchard drowning. No story, nothing. And the death certificate still hasn't turned up. But you know it's Mrs. Tuggle's brother. Everyone knows it. She says so herself. So why do you need anything else? I don't really. But once the secretaries got started talking, I thought it would help to get the original story and stop all the gossip that's going around. But there's not even an obituary. It's really weird. One of the women in payroll said that her mother told her there was never any funeral either, that Mrs. Tuggle just began telling people that the boy had drowned, and a new gravestone went up in the cemetery. Then you do believe there might be something to all the gossip, said Lynn. Mrs. Morley glanced at her. Little pitchers have big ears, she murmured. I don't believe anything of the kind, Lynn, Father said. Years ago, the courthouse wasn't so systematic about keeping records. Anything could have happened, and a funeral ceremony isn't necessary, you know. A body has to be buried, but there's nothing on the books that says there has to be a service. Just because we can't find any story or death certificate doesn't mean that someone was murdered. Who was murdered? Piped up Stevie from the dining room, where he was drawing helicopters on long sheets of shelf paper. He jumped off his chair and stood in the doorway. Who was murdered, Daddy? See, said Mrs. Morley to Lynn, that's exactly the way rumors get started. That's the way it was in the courthouse. One of the secretaries made an offhand remark, wondered something out loud, and someone else picked it up, embellished it a little, and passed it on. And the first thing we know, there's a murderess at large. Who? Stevie demanded. Nobody, said Father emphatically. A figment of the imagination, that's what. A what? Said Stevie, confused. And then he got angry. Nobody ever tells me anything. You've always got secrets. He threw down his pencil and buried his head in one arm, leaning against the doorway. Just because I'm little, nobody ever tells me secrets, he bellowed. Mrs. Morley put her manuscript aside. Come here, Stevie, and I'll tell you a secret just for you, she coaxed. Stevie sauntered over, his lower lip sticking out, and stood grumpily by her chair. She pulled him down to whisper in his ear, but Lynn, sitting only a few feet away, could hear. We're having liver for supper, and afterwards I'm going to let you take a little bit up to Mrs. Tuggles and feed it to her cat. I've got a secret about liver, Stevie yelped importantly, marching around the living room. Lynn watched her father tie his work shoes and go outside to put on the storm windows. Stevie tagged along to help, leaving Lynn and her mother in the quiet of the living room. Mrs. Morley picked up her manuscript again and chewed on the stem of her glasses while she read over the last paragraph. How's the book coming, Mother? Lynn asked. Well, better than it was, but there's still a long way to go before it comes alive. Sometimes I think my writing lacks variety. There are too many pages of narrative, not enough dialogue to keep it moving. I know a song, a poem sort of, you could put in your book. You could have one of the witches sing it, maybe. Mother smiled. Let's hear it. Lynn didn't know how the melody went, but she remembered the words. Sing of morning, sing of noon. Sing of evening, silver moon. Feel the darkness touch the black. Hear the shadows whisper back. Why, that's lovely, Lynn. It's both eerie and lilting. I wonder if it's copyrighted. Where did you see it? I didn't. Mrs. Tuggle sang it the evening Marjorie and I took her the muffins. Doesn't she have some interesting songs, though? You have a good memory for words, Lynn. Maybe you'll want to do some sort of writing yourself someday. No, Lynn declared. I'm going to be a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist? Mrs. Morley leaned back and gave Lynn her full attention. Well, that would be an interesting profession. What made you think of that? Because I'm interested in people. I like to know what they're thinking, why they do what they do. I mean, well, take Mouse. The way she dresses, the way she's been acting since her mother moved away. Why do some people care how they look and others don't? Why are some people selfish and others aren't? Why are some people afraid of snakes and things, and other people pick them right up? I just like to know things like that. But being a psychiatrist is a lot more than just knowing things. It's helping people feel better about themselves. I know, and I wish I could do that for Mouse. It's got to come from inside, honey. The feeling that she's worth something to somebody. But you can do a lot by showing her you're her friend no matter what. She needs a lot of extra love these days. Miss Tuggle and I were talking about it the other morning. How sad it is, a girl her age without a mother close by. Mother, I wish you wouldn't talk to Mrs. Tuggle about Marjorie. But why not? She's concerned. It's just that, well, Mouse is sensitive about these things, and she wouldn't want everyone talking about her. I haven't said anything to anyone I wouldn't say in front of Marjorie herself, Mrs. Morley said. But if you think she would object, I won't discuss her again. Mother seemed so willing to talk, so understanding, that Lynn was on the verge of telling her about the crows and the charm around the cat's neck. She wanted so much to share her fears with somebody, but she stopped, her lips pressed together. She knew that were she to try to show Mother the crows, they would disappear as before. And as for the charm around the cat's neck, Mrs. Morley did not believe in the significance of such things. No, it would be best to wait for another time. Proof. If only she had proof. She could hold it in her hand, something that wouldn't fly away. Mouse, however, had nothing at all against charms. When Lynn met her outside the house Monday on the way to school, she noticed that Marjorie was wearing a tarnished silver ring. What's that on your finger? She asked. The ring was also too big. Mouse had wound adhesive tape around it and back to make it fit more tightly. Protection, Mouse said simply. Lynn, I just had to. I've been so scared. Her eyes darted up to the trees along the street where the crows, of course, were waiting. I read some more of that book on spells and potions and found a charm that's supposed to give protection from witches. You have to take the ring of someone who has died, wrap it in silk, bury it under an oak tree for one night, dip it in vinegar, and hold it over the flames of a candle while you repeat 7 times, Wing and water, earth and sky, keep me safe from witches. Is that all? Asked Lynn. That's all. But I have to wear it constantly. If I ever take it off, even for a minute, the book said the power is gone. "So where did you get the ring, Mouse?" Lynn was almost afraid to ask. When Mouse was desperate, she'd do anything. "It used to belong to my grandmother, and she's dead. I wrapped it in one of Mother's old silk scarves, buried it under the oak tree in our yard on Saturday night, dipped it in vinegar Sunday morning, and recited the words while I held it over a flame with tweezers. But I don't feel any braver. Albeit it just doesn't work." "Just the same, don't take it off, Mouse. Maybe it's one of those power of positive thinking things. If you really believe it will work, you'll actually be braver and more able to protect yourself. Anyway, why don't you bring that book over after school and we'll see if there's anything else in it we could use." "I can't. It's one of Daddy's rare books. I can't take it out of the house. He doesn't even know I've been reading it. And we'd better not let him catch us either, because he'll say you're influencing me again to believe in witchcraft." "Is that what he really thinks? He said it last night at dinner." They walked on for a way without talking. It was awful not to be believed, especially by people who loved you and would be concerned if anything happened. It was like the bad dreams that Lynn had from time to time, in which something horrible was happening to her. Maybe she was standing in a rowboat and it was drifting out to sea, or she was sitting in a meadow and a pack of wolves was coming closer and closer, and always, when she would call out to her parents to come and rescue her, they would just look at her and go on talking as though it were nothing at all. Then suddenly they would realize she really was in danger. But it would be too late. At that point, Lynn always woke up, her heart pounding, her forehead wet with perspiration, feeling both terrified and angry. By mid-October, it was obvious to Lynn that the presence of crows was affecting them both. Lynn and Mouse withdrew to themselves, their voices more subdued, eyes on the trees. The other girls seemed to take the hint and leave them alone. Once at recess, when the others were jumping rope out on the sidewalk, a fifth grader pointed to the crows and said she bet they had a nest up there because she'd noticed them sitting there that morning. At that, the crows flew away. Mouse and Lynn looked at each other but said nothing. The birds did not return until it was time to go home. But by then, the other girls had forgotten and no longer noticed them at all. It was the effect on Mouse that worried Lynn the most. Marjorie had always been a good student, B average at least, and now she found it hard to concentrate on her work. Often Lynn noticed that she read only half the chapter the teacher assigned and did not turn in any homework at all. She rarely raised her hand in class, but sat staring out the window during group sessions. Once the teacher spoke to her sharply, telling her to keep her thoughts on her work. But then after school, she apologized to Mouse and said she knew that things had been sort of difficult for her at home. Another time, during a social studies test, a large crow flew right down on the window ledge by Marjorie's seat, and Mouse burst into tears. The teacher sent her to the health room to lie down. Slowly, Lynn was coming to a decision. She could not let it go. She could not let it go on any longer. Something had to be done, and she could not count on her parents to help. She had to go to Mrs. Tuggle's house alone, confront her with what she knew, and tell her that unless she kept the crows away, she would tell her parents. If that didn't work, and Mrs. Tuggle knew she was bluffing, she would tell her that the town was already whispering about her, and she had better watch her step. It took almost a week to make the decision, and Lynn fully admitted to herself that she was afraid. It was frightening, first of all, to accuse a woman the family had known for some time, even though they did not know her well. Mrs. Tuggle always pretended to be friendly, and Lynn had always been polite. Now to accuse her of something to her face. What if it wasn't true? She could imagine how shocked and hurt and angry Mrs. Tuggle would be, and felt embarrassed. She knew the old woman would tell Mother, and the Morleys would ask Lynn how she could ever have thought of doing such an awful thing. But she was also terrified that perhaps Mrs. Tuggle would react angrily, perhaps even do something to her, and she wouldn't even have Marjorie there to protect her. She had to keep Mouse away no matter what. She had already made up her mind that she would go out some afternoon rather than at night. She would simply tell Mother she was going for a walk and go straight up the hill. She would drink no tea, make no polite small talk, but come right to the point. It seemed so simple, but just thinking about it made her heart race. On the third Saturday in October, the time seemed right. Marjorie had gone downtown to help out at her father's store. Mother and Judith were baking bread. Stevie was playing at a friend's house, and Mr. Morley was attending a meeting on the town master plan. Everybody was busy. No one would really miss her or feel the need to question her when she came back. The sun was out, and the fields, now brown and dry with autumn, shone gold. It was a very ordinary day, and Lynn did not feel quite so shaky. As she started up the hill, however, she realized it might be easier to make her accusations when the old woman looked more creepy. If Mrs. Tuggle greeted her at the door with an apron on, and the fragrance of cinnamon rolls in the air, how on earth could Lynn stick to her plan? She decided, therefore, to say the first words before she took one step inside, to set the mood before it was set for her. And there would be no turning back. How was it possible, she wondered as she reached the top, for Mrs. Tuggle's house to look so ominous even in the middle of the afternoon, instead of the spots of sunlight reflected on the old roof? She was more aware of the dark shadows made by the chimneys and the deep caverns between the gables. While everywhere else in the town basked in the glory of a warm autumn day, Mrs. Tuggle's yard looked as though it had been passed by, as though the warmth could not penetrate the pines and thorn-apple trees that surrounded the place. Perhaps she should have at least mentioned to Mother that she might stop in at Mrs. Tuggle's. What if no one ever saw her again? She wanted to stop and go over her speech once more, but when she reached the iron fence, she knew that if Mrs. Tuggle were watching, it would appear that she was hesitant and scared, which in fact she was, so she forced her feet to keep moving, her legs to keep walking. She opened the gate, closed it behind her, went up the narrow brick path to the porch, and reached for the knocker. Here she couldn't help but pause, however. She had never liked the heavy door knocker, and on this particular day she liked it even less. It was shaped to look like a troll with its tongue sticking out, and once Lynn had felt sure that the strange brass creature rolled its eyes. Quickly, before she could change her mind, she grabbed hold of it and banged it against the thick door. She liked the forceful sound of her banging, and she was glad she had not tapped timidly. She waited, listening for the telltale sound of footsteps inside. A minute passed. Nothing happened. She knocked again, even louder than before. Still no one came. She felt both disappointed and relieved. All this worry and suspense, and the woman wasn't even home. Or perhaps she was. Maybe she had seen Lynn coming and refused to open the door. Lynn walked over to a window and peered in. All was dark, but suddenly, in the reflection of the glass, she saw the eyes of Mrs. Tuggle grinning at her and wheeling around. Found herself face to face with the old woman. And that's the end of chapter 3.